and being are three different ways to think about volunteering. Actually, they're three different ways to think about life, but I'm going to look at them as they apply to volunteering. Because volunteering, arguably, has been very much a part of South Africa's past and Africa's past, and South Africa's future and Africa's future. If we think about the past, we know that part of our colonial and imperial history had volunteers there. You know, not all of the colonialists who came to Africa came to exploit Africa. Some of them came to Africa because they truly believed that they had the light and Africa needed it. My own father was a missionary. I was conceived on the way to Zambia. He gave up a very promising career as a mathematician at Wits University in order to give everything up and go to Zambia with no house, no car, no possessions, just a dream in his heart and a seed in his wife's belly. So I do know that I have part of that sort of imperial idea that my truth is better than your truth coursing through my veins. And I've been a volunteer for most of my life, so I do have to think very carefully about why do I do the things that I do. Volunteering is also going to be very much part of our future because, as we know, we now have Madiba Day in South Africa. On Nelson Mandela's birthday on the 18th of July, South Africans and, in fact, people all over the world are encouraged to give 67 minutes of their time volunteering for people less privileged. So as we embark on this idea of volunteering as part of South Africa's future, I'd like us to just stop for a moment and think about various ways that we can think about volunteering. And that is doing, knowing, and being. I'm going to speak about these as though they are completely separate ways of being, but of course you'll see that by the end of it, that isn't really the case at all. But see where you recognize yourself. So let's have a look at knowing. Doing. When we think about doing something, like doing volunteering, it's something that we, here I am, a separate human, there the world is, a separate place, and I do something. I have sort of positive regard towards the world and the people in the world that aren't me, but they're them. And when I do volunteering, I sort of direct myself towards the world in order to do something. And I think of doing as something to do with our hands. So we get our hands dirty, and then we leave the volunteering space and we be whoever else we are. And we do a lot of things like that. Some people do relationships like that. Oh, I haven't spoken to my mother. Oh, quickly SMS. Yay, I've done it. We do relationships. We do teaching. I go and teach, and then whew, that's over. I tick the box, and I can carry on with the rest of my life. So doing is kind of a bit of a separate activity. And many people think about doing volunteering like that. 67 minutes one day a year is kind of doing volunteering. Let's look at knowing volunteering. And we're in a university, so we do a lot of knowing. And knowing volunteering is set up in very much a similar way to doing volunteering. I'm separate. I have my own ideas and thoughts. I'm directed towards a world over there, and there are people in it. And when I'm knowing volunteering, I'm thinking a lot about volunteering. So I like to think of knowing as something that we do with our heads. We don't even have to get our hands dirty. Ideally, it would be good if we spoke to people who volunteered or spoke to people who benefited from volunteering in order to increase our knowing. But in knowing, we read, we write, we think, we talk to people in order to gain an impression and sound authoritative because we know volunteering. Let's look at being. Being is set up quite differently. If I be a volunteer, I am a volunteer. I'm not doing it 4 times in my life. I'm immersed in the world in which I'm volunteering. I'm not separate from it. The people that I'm volunteering amongst are equal to me, sometimes better than me. I'm not superior to them, on the outside of them, directing myself towards them. I'm in them, among them, of them, and being a volunteer is about having a lifestyle of volunteering. And we know that in this country there are many people who have lived their lives as volunteers. We know that many people are involved, their whole lives are involved in unpaid labor, unrecognized work, as they volunteer their time in order to care for families, in order to care for communities, in order to make the world a better place for other people. That's being. I'm going to be a little bit crass now, and I'm a sort of anarchic socialist, but I'm very much aware that we're in a capitalist ethos. So I'm going to have a look at these three ways of being in terms of what do we need and what do we get. A sort of cost and benefit analysis of if we do volunteering, if we know volunteering, and if we be a volunteer. So let's look at doing first. If we do volunteering, what do we need? Firstly, we need skills. So for instance, one of the things that I do is I volunteer on a Wednesday morning from 9 to 10 at the Little Dragon Preschool, and I help two little guys, Kieran and Kawe, to introduce them to reading and writing. Now, I'm a teacher, but I have no idea how to teach preschool kids. So I needed to have some skills, learn some skills. I've got some skills, but they actually needed to be added to before I could go and do this volunteering task. We need resources when we volunteer. You can't just go there with nothing. So when I go and teach my two little guys, I've got a blue folder with pictures and words and games to play, and I take that along with me when I go and do my volunteering session. So when we do volunteering, we need resources in order to carry out the function of volunteering. And of course, we need opportunities. Just because I'm going to volunteer doesn't mean I want to go and make friends with a project and set it all up. I want to just do my little slot, please. So someone else needs to set it up, organize it, make the relationship, maintain the relationship so that I can go and bring my particular skill in order to carry out my volunteering. And of course, we need energy, because when you are volunteering at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, it doesn't matter what you did the night before or what else you've got to do on that day. There are two little guys who've been waiting all week for you. You have to be there. So sometimes when we do volunteering, it can take a huge amount of energy because it's going against the grain of how we normally are. And that takes energy, and that can be draining. And what do we get from doing volunteering like this? Well, we need skills, so we get training. And we get training and we get something that we can write on our CV. And often, you know, that's quite a motivation for people to get involved in projects because it looks good on the CV. So yes, certainly if you do volunteering, you can get a little tick. You've had the training, you've got the skills, you've done the job. And of course, we need donations because of the resources we need. And you know, in this country, I think there are many NGOs and many projects that are desperate for funding. And there are constant appeals going out to people, please give, if you can't give your time, give your money. And there are plenty of donors who are prepared to throw money at the project. And so good NGOs do keep getting donations. Well, sometimes good NGOs don't get donations, and that's a sad thing. What we get from this is we get experience. And often that can be a very helpful part of doing volunteering, because even if we're just doing a slot, we come away from there having been challenged in some way. So I would say that that's a really positive benefit from doing volunteering. And finally, we do get tired, exactly because when we're doing the doing way of it, we're having to be something that we're not necessarily, okay? And because that takes energy, we sometimes get tired and drained when we're doing it too often. All right, let's think about knowing volunteering. And in order to know volunteering, we need information, we need data, we need particular theories and ways to think about this data. We need to have interviews with people. We run surveys, people do field work. Again, we don't actually have to do the volunteering, but we think about it, we read about it, and we make up theories about volunteering. What do we get? We get published if we're good enough. And if we do get published, we often get critique. And some of that is positive and some of that is negative. And if we get a lot of positive critique, then we get followers. And some people sitting in this audience, have a lot of followers on their Facebook page. And recently, they even suggested to their Facebook friends that, would some of you please like to go off my Facebook page because I've reached my 5,000 limit and there's some new ones who want to come in. So we can get a lot of followers. Eusebius, you'll hear him later. We get followers, if we're saying the right kinds of things. But what is that? We still haven't done any volunteering. So let's look at what do we need in order to be a volunteer. And I think you can tell which of these ways I approve of the most. And I would argue that what you need most of all in order to be a volunteer is you need to be human. You need to be aware of your own humanity in order to be a part of the humanity of others. A part of being that human is being open and willing to learn from each other, not coming with an assumption of rightness, of superiority, but a willingness to hear and to listen. What do people need? What are people thinking? And how do I fit into all of that? So it's quite an open sort of a space. And what we need when we be volunteers is we need to be vulnerable. Because vulnerability is probably the most human thing about us. And if we're always needing to be that strong, impervious person separate from the world and who isn't going to be touched or damaged from engagement with the world, then I think we're missing the point. I think that being a volunteer means we embrace our vulnerability as part of the beautiful thing that makes us human. And what do we get from being a volunteer? Well, I'd argue that we get more humanity, that as we are very human and present and vulnerable and open and willing, we engage with those aspects of other humans around us. And of course, we learn a lot because we're open, because we're willing to learn, because we're listening more than talking. When we be a volunteer, we learn an awful lot, not only about ourselves, but about our common humanity. You don't have to ask for opportunities when you be a volunteer. If you're being a volunteer in the world, opportunities keep presenting themselves to you. So I think it was in the doing part, we need opportunities. In the being part, we get opportunities over and over again. And part of our experience of being volunteers is that we become stronger in one way, in that we begin to understand far more about our common humanity. And sometimes, because the world is a cruel place, sometimes when we are that way in the world, when we go into the world with our skin on and little else, we can get damaged and we can even get killed for our ideas. Because the world is a whole lot of competing ideas about what works. And not everybody believes that volunteering and giving is the way to go. Open source is not is a threat to capitalist ways of thinking about things. So when you be a volunteer in this way, there is some chance that you're going to get cut down. And I want to challenge you that when you do get cut down for being, that's not the end of the row. And I'd like to think of it as if you chop down a tree, if the tree has been there for a while, there's always the chance that seeds have fallen down into the ground below. So when you chop down that tree, the seed of how that tree has lived its life is in that same soil in order to grow into something different. So I'd like to suggest that if you do be in the world in this way, and if you be a volunteer in this way, that even when there are those forces that might chop you down from being all that you want to be, that there's a new you to be if that one doesn't work. Okay, so these three separate approaches to life and to volunteering, of course, it really works well when we use all of them together. The longer I've been a volunteer in my life, the more I've learned, the more I've thought about what it is I'm doing, the more I've tried to be very conscious about what I'm doing. And when these three work together, when we're in the world, when we're thinking about what we're doing and being conscious of all the changes that are happening around us, and that informs the kinds of things that we do. And I think if we're interested in a future in Africa that involves our hearts, our heads, and our hands, that we need to use this way of thinking, of knowing, of doing, but most of all, being part of the common humanity that makes up South Africa. And I sometimes ask myself that I know that I love Africa and I know that I'm in Africa, but one of the debates in South Africa is, can I call myself an African, me with my white skin? And I'd like to suggest that, I don't know if I can, but I'd like to suggest that one way towards being in Africa, being an African, and it doesn't matter what color your skin is, one way to be an African is to be in the world in this way, to know, to reflect, to think about how we are, so that the things that we do are really building a progressive and a happier place for everybody. Thanks.